There we go. Get a good number of pre-registrations, so looks like they're kicking in. Welcome, everybody. As you're entering the room, we'll be getting started in a moment, trying to let everybody have a chance to get into the webinar. Welcome, everyone who's joining us. We're just giving it a little more time for all those that pre-registered to have a chance to get on board. I'm sure we'll have a few more people joining along the way, but I do want to respect everyone's time, especially that of our guests today. And so I want to go ahead and get started. My name is Deborah Gaston. I'm Director of Education and Interpretation at the National Museum of Women in the Arts. And actually going forward, I will probably be referring to the museum as NMWA, much easier. And on behalf of the museum, I want to welcome you to today's conversation with UK-based artist Shawanda Corbett, who is here with me on the screen. We're presenting this program in collaboration with the UK Friends of NMWA, which is one of our 28 national and international committees that do outreach for the museum and with the museum. And I'd like to say a particular thank you to committee members Susan Zimney and Patty White, who worked closely with me to develop this program. Today's program is being cart captioned by Joy Horton. And if you would like to access the captioning, click the CC button at the bottom of your screen to activate it. So I'm very pleased to introduce our guest today, Shawanda Corbett, who is known for her pottery, painting, performance, film, and photography. And through all of that, really working to reframe notions of gender, race, and the complete body. Raised in Mississippi and now based in the UK, the self-described cyborg artist draws on influences ranging from Japanese and West African ceramic traditions, and also jazz music and cyborg theory, as well as her lived experience as a differently able-bodied Black woman. And we'll be touching on aspects of all of these things through the course of our conversation today. We have about an hour together. And I will say it would be more accurate actually to introduce our guest as Dr. Shawanda Corbett. She holds a PhD in fine arts from the Ruskin School of Art at Oxford University. And in just a few short years, beginning in 2021, she's been on a fast upward trajectory, has received a prestigious Turner Bursary Prize, had her first solo exhibition in the US, and represented the UK at the Venice Biennale in 23. And so I'd like to say welcome, Shawanda, and we're so happy to have you join us today.
Hello.
Wonderful. All these miracles of being able to talk across countries and so forth, and getting the time spans to line up. But during our hour together, Shawanda and I are going to be teasing out some of the complexities of her artistic practice, including her processes, influences, and themes. And I'll be sharing some images of her work and posing some questions. And I'm guessing those of you joining us will also have some questions of your own. So please feel free to add them to the chat or the Q&A, and we'll do our best to address them. And I will say my colleague, who is our senior educator here at the museum, Addie Gayoso, is helping keep an eye on your questions and comments behind the scenes today. So I thank her for that. So to get us started, I'm going to go ahead and share our screen, give us a little something to look at while we talk. And and get all of my various boxes back open. So I can keep an eye on things. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up, oops, too far. Our first image here, Shawanda, as we get started. And this, of course, is an installation view of the Art Now exhibition, Let the Sunshine In, that you did with the Tate. And it gives us a sense of some of the combination of your ceramic work, as well as a still on the back screen there of from your film that we'll be talking about more in a moment. But I actually thought we'd start with your own description of yourself as a cyborg artist, which I suspect isn't familiar terminology for most of our listeners. It certainly wasn't to me when I first began learning about you and your work. And yet it's terminology that you favor, I know, over other identity labels, and is central to much of your work, including your first film, as I mentioned, seen in the background here. And I understand that Donna Haraway's generative essay, A Cyborg Manifesto, that she produced in 1985, was really your starting point. And so I'd love if you'd share your own engagement with Haraway's essay, and what about it appealed to you? Why and in what ways have you expanded that concept to be more inclusive?
Yeah, with Cyborg's Manifesto, I was really intrigued by how she used cyborg terminology to um, address, women's issue in society, and, really focus on, I guess, in a way of showing how women's rights are very important. Um, but one of the things that, and although she really used her point of view to talk about her perspective, um, I really wanted to, I really wanted to talk about my perspective as a person of color that's queer, that's, you know, Black, and, from a working class, lower working class, which is some of the things that wasn't clearly addressed in her uh, writing, which again is from her perspective. And so I love science fiction, always love science fiction. I love how, especially like from the time, like from the 60s, when everything like in the films and shows that all the set design and everything, costumes were like kind of clunky. And I really love that. So, it's everything, like coming from a craft background, you're taught to make things, and you adapt what you learn to other mediums. And so I wanted to carry that on. And so like what I wanted with the cyborg theory is to create a theory, which is kind of based out of my own ceramics practice. And I wanted to start off with the identity, which is cyborg. And cyborg is a very much so like not a replace, I would say a replacement for, you know, disability, disabled, handicap, all those terms that is very problematic socially, um, because like you use those terms and you're automatically um, just it is just a preconception of uh, prejudice of what the person is capable of doing. And so what I wanted to do was I was use cyborg because I identify more with that because I love science fiction. And although it doesn't really change the I guess the social interactions, like how they see me, it's just more about how I see myself. And to for me mentally and creatively to go any place where I decide to go and very much so be myself within my practice.
Thank you. I mean, I think that's really, I found it really interesting when I was reading more about some of the things you were saying, and the idea of really sort of choosing a term that's not normally sort of pigeonholed in the same way, and allows you to really shape who you are without, it's like finding new words is often necessary to kind of change things. So I really appreciated that. And I know it relates as well to this idea that you talk about of the complete body. And I think you were sort of beginning to touch on that just now. Can you say a little bit more about that in relationship to the cyborg theory?
Yeah, I think when we think about uh, what is a complete body, and I think it's just now that, well, we'll start with like physically, is, during the growing process of a child, during, the stages of being born. And, we think, you know, what that body appears to be is like, we have two of like hands, arms, legs, um, and that is complete. But I think for me, it is, you know, it's kind of beyond that. Like, yeah, I was born, you know, not even like without, because the growth was the growth process has ended, so like I was born with whatever condition that I have. But even beyond that, for everyone's, physical body changes over time, mental, health like changes over time. We can't necessarily guess what our body is going to be like, as we get older. And it does change, whether it's with age or temporary things happening to the body. So I wanted to kind of connect everyone on that everyone's body goes through these things, and everyone, kind of meet with that. So it's like whatever your body has changed to, that's still complete. It doesn't
Yeah.
feel complete, it's still complete. But also like on a social level, we have like groups, what is the group of different communities, different like societies. What does that look like? What is that complete body?
Mhm. Yeah, I do love that idea of sort of thinking more about not that what's lacking, but sort of what is, and that continues to be complete, um, regardless, and the connection into the other cultures as well, I think makes, and other groups, I think is it's a real wonderful way of not doing the kind of othering, I think, that happens so often with the labels we attach to different groups in different ways. So it really sort of frees that up. I will say, I'm sure one of the challenges of the fact that you're finding such inspiration in what's really a complex theory, and it's certainly, especially with the extensions you've made to it in your own thinking, it's like, how do you move theory into practice, kind of make it tangible and to show up in something kind of concrete, if you will. And what I'd like to do is share a short clip from your film, the still we're seeing in the background here, but we have a clip. The film is called Cyborg Theory, The Adequacy of Tenderness to Our Antipathy. And then after the clip, maybe have you speak more specifically to what we're seeing and hearing. This is the fingers crossed moment during all technology. There we go. Actually, too far. Well, I was really thrilled that you were able to sort of share that clip with us, Shawanda. And I know this is actually your first film, and it was part of the Tate installation. So I'd love to have you talk a little bit more about maybe how the concept of cyborg or the complete body is addressed within the film, through the installation as a whole, and also kind of, what inspired you to sort of delve into film at this time.
I would say one of the things that really influenced me moving more towards film was Oscar Schlemmer's ballet um, from the Bauhaus movement, which love it. Um, so what I wanted to do was put dancers in environments that either restrict them, like put them in things and wooden sculptures that restricts their movement, and to challenge, just challenge how the way they move. But mainly what the film is really focused on is, what goes on in a Black person's mind, Black or brown person's mind throughout the day. So that is just the opening scene. So it's like, it's set, each scene is like a block of time starting from midnight. So it's late night, um, and then it kind of, deconstructs towards the middle, and then it just kind of like, yeah, so it comes back together towards the end. And so every character is like assigned to an instrument. So everything that I do is start off with like a graphic notation score that I've written and work with other jazz musicians. And they understand that what they play is assigned to a dancer. So I told them this is, of course, these are the simples, but this is how I want you to play it because the movements are going to be like X, Y, and Z. So they have full control over the dancers, which I really loved. And, and gave the dancers the agency to move within the structure of what the instrument has provided. And only that. So all of it for the dancers is completely improvised, but it's really beautiful to see how they react to one another and how well they kind of sync up. So yeah, like that is, it's more of the mental health. So instead of like, what is reality? What is daydream? What is dream state? Uh, what is it like coming into conflict, coming down off of that deterioration of the mind, but also how do you recover from that? How do you keep going? Yeah. So
I know we're going to be circling back a little bit later and talking a little bit more about jazz and sort of the role of music in your practice more broadly. So I love that you sort of touched on that aspect here and that you were actually composing in this case, which I think is amazing. And I love the idea of the improvisation of the dancers being such a key piece of it as well, as they sort of occupy space, as you said, through these blocks of kind of moments of the day and their sort of body in those moments. Well, I guess I will say that, having just done this little opening section here, I think our audience will have gathered that you are, in fact, really truly embrace a multifaceted art practice. And since we began sort of with our futuristic cyborgs, or maybe not so futuristic, I would love to spend some time now sort of digging into your ceramic works. I know ceramics really are, get us another image to look at here. There we go. They have a centuries-old tradition, of course, in countries and cultures around the world. And yet you successfully are able to bring your very personal contemporary viewpoint to that tradition. So I thought we'd have this image on the screen at least to start with. It's from your first solo exhibition that was in London, and use it as a backdrop to have you, share a bit about what drew you to ceramics, and how you developed your creative process and techniques through working with the medium.
Yeah, so ceramics for me started off as an elective actually. And I had this professor named Al Poland, and she was like great. We had to do like this a process called raku firing, which is like you get the ceramics really hot, and then we would put it in a trash can full of combustible. You have to burp it, you have these big flames. And one of the moments was like, I'm pretty sure I lost an eyebrow in that process. But I really love the physicality of it. I started off as a graphic design major, but I love physically working, with craft. And so I wanted to stick with that. And that kind of had this bit of a love-hate relationship with ceramics. Because hand building, I got you. I can do that. When we moved to like the wheel, did not. I was quite bad at the beginning. And so that was more of a challenge, and spent a lot of time with throwing and figuring out different throwing techniques that would help me. Because like naturally when I hand build, it is West African, so indigenous as well. But when I throw, I just needed something, that is more, um, just like the way you're taught, you need two hands, it needs to be like this. And I'm just like, well, this is not working for me. Um, and so like a lot of Japanese pottery like techniques really helped in building, and then but what really helped me to get out of the way of thinking as well, because even I started to believe that, was a mathematician during my like I think a calculus course I was taking. And we were talking about like this sine, cosine, tangent. I was terrible at it. And it was just like, well, ceramics, you don't really need, need two hands. You just need like a point, surface, and all of that. And I was just like, oh, well, I'm gonna take that. So that kind of helped me and start on my journey of throwing. And so my ceramics is very vessel. That was my one of my main focuses, um, along with traditional, production pottery. And I went through all these different processes, but what I decided to do for this first exhibition was to instead of using like glazes and oxides and things like that, I wanted to use underglaze to create, imagery on the ceramics. But I wanted something that's more meaningful to me, because it was during around the time of COVID. So, I was thinking about all the people, in the past that really influenced me. And it was more like love from over the pond. And so what I decided to do was to focus on the different types of people that has influenced me, but also the people that I chose from all these different um, you know, neighborhoods that I lived in. There was like this stereotype in every place that I lived, and groups of people that I lived in and grew up around, and you think about main media and social media, it is not they're not pictured all that well, very negatively spoken about. And so I wanted to like highlight those people, mainly because out of love, but also every community has their own archetype of person that is viewed negatively on media. because you see that, you interact with it every day, and just wanted to show a different side of them. So instead of doing traditional like not photography, but like portraiture and things like that, I wanted to do more of kind of the essence of their personality, the things that they would say. That's kind of like the titles of the ceramics, and yeah.
Yeah, I love the sort of personalities that, like, as you look at the vessels, which, share a certain, there's a formal relationship. We can sort of tell they belong together, and were produced by, a particular artist, but they have these like little tiny differences, apart from the decoration even, but just like the slight angles of some and the sort of their postures, if you will, and almost like gestures and the way they seem to interact with the other vessels as well. They really do take on personalities in a way I find really amazing. Um, and were they, when you were thinking about this, are these, I guess, see if I order this right, are they particular people or more like the kind of those sort of general types that you were mentioning earlier as being sort of certain types in neighborhoods?
It is definitely the general types
Mhm.
in the neighborhoods. Like, for example, I have two vessels that is called the Candy Lady. And what that is in the neighborhood is a woman. She's typically a woman that sells like very discounted like snacks and things like that to the neighborhood. But mostly like neighborhood kids go to it, especially like over the summer.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so it's more, you know, different neighborhoods that I lived in had that type of character person in each neighborhood. So
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's like those are those kind of archetypes that kind of transcend specific neighborhoods sometimes, or there's the same type, yeah. So I love that idea. Um, and the connections that's so personal to you, but then opens it up sort of for people to make their own associations and sort of bring their own memories and experiences to it, which I like as well. I brought in, have a couple of details that you shared with me, just so people can see some of your vessels a little closer. These are from a different installation, but the sort of range of sort of finishes that you get, the colors, both kind of a matte, but very sort of vibrant hues, especially seen on the one on the right. And you have these like gorgeous, almost look like almost iridescent pastels and sort of quality to the ones on the left. And I'm just wondering, you mentioned sort of the dramatic early types of firing that you did, but how are you sort of achieving and coming up with your surfaces in this case? Can you say just a little more about that?
it is very much different underglazes that I use.
Mhm.
So using more of the painting process, and the firing is in an electric kiln instead of like a gas.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Cool. Well, I know now that we can see some of the sort of imagery up close, I know that, of course, you also paint because you do all of the things. Um, and I know I'd read that there's a certain relationship between the paintings and the kind of imagery there and the vessels themselves. And could you share a little bit more about how you sort of see these going together and sort of how they sort of set up a conversation?
Yeah, so for the ceramics, usually I start off with a painting, different like an image, and then I go into making the vessel. But for the paintings is like a similar process as far as like people that has influenced me. So it's more of a this is the things that they say, this is what they look like in that moment. Um, and so it's more of a conversation. It's a bigger group, a wider range. Even though some of them aren't physically embodied, they're two dimensional, two dimensionally embodied in in a painting. Yeah.
Yeah, I like the way, I know it seems to me from looking at various sort of installations and just reading things and then hearing you talk today as well, but this idea that in some ways, you're combining, video or photography and film and painting and the ceramics, and it almost becomes this kind of almost an installation grouping with all of the pieces sort of interacting with one another and shaping the space and our experience of it. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, you're absolutely getting it right. When it's definitely comes off of the idea of what is a garden, neighborhood garden.
Mm.
And so that concept is how people move through the space. So like the space itself is a physical like landscape of where these people would live and how they would live and things like that. But it is also like with the ceramics in particular, it's choreographed through the music that is referenced.
Mm.
So while the music is playing, myself and the curator would place them as the music plays, as a response to it. So you have a more natural feel
Mm.
moving throughout the space.
I love that. So sort of choreographing the installation
Yeah.
just as you would a sort of a dance performance. I love
Mhm.
that as a way to kind of create. Yeah, I guess that's probably part of why they do feel like they, kind of converse or are interrelating to each other in ways that we might not expect from sort of theoretically inanimate objects. They take on a certain animation and engagement. So I hadn't thought about this sort of choreographing the installation as part of that. I love that idea. Um, since we're talking a little bit about, like the people that have, you have memories of, or the neighborhoods and so forth. I will say one of the things, I want to pull up another image here. One of the things that caught my attention early on as I started to learn more about you and your work was the trajectory your life has taken from New York City to the town of Pascagoula on Mississippi's Gulf Coast, which would be quite a change to begin with. And then from Mississippi to Oxford, England. And of course, you're also, exhibiting your works globally. This is, of course, a recent exhibition you had in Tokyo. And, this idea of you're referencing things that are so particular to you, the people, the places of your past. But so I'm curious to know a little bit more about sort of how your geographical journey has shaped your creative journey. How did each place sort of, does it play a role in kind of what we're looking at, or how you've evolved? I'd be curious to know more about that.
Yeah. Well, we moved a lot. So let's start there. So between New York and Mississippi, I think one of the main things that kind of stays consistent was um, my family, like the older generations, what they listened to.
Hmm.
So very much influenced by music, blues, jazz, even classical music, uh, and even like the Harlem Renaissance was a huge influence as well. Um, and even going to the South and being very much influenced by you know, I was very much so introduced into like Mexican painters, and other different cultures as well. And and also like literature for sure. So we had that, and each location had a different variation of that, kind of opened me up to think things differently. Because like in New York, I was very influenced by when we introduced it, like grade school of Beethoven. And I was like, yes, I want to do that. Like they talk about how, kind of like I think his mental health wasn't all that great. I was like, you know what? I will trade I would like give up my childhood just to learn how to play the piano. Um, but also like on the south, like in the South, it was Louis Armstrong, and it was BB King, that was popular. Um, so it's just like a very wide range of things to look at, you know. And we watched a lot of films, with from the era of like Gregory Hines in films and uh and also like I don't know, like different like ballet performances and stuff like that that you will see on like public broadcasting and things like that. And so yeah, like everything has influenced how I make my work now. Um, but just not necessarily the entire work, but it's more about the foundation. So every location gets a piece of my background. So like you get an introduction and then we move on with the story. We move on with everything else. So there's a whole different story that's being built in real time.
So in a way, each of these sort of groups of works that we're sort of looking at today, they're sort of function almost like chapters. Is that in a sort of life, a sort of ongoing story?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say you were talking about all the sort of musical influences and so forth. And I know, for instance, that your brother is a choreographer and dancer, and so that clearly there was a lot of emphasis, I think it sounds like, for you all to both absorb that and, head off into these highly creative careers, and sort of the influence of that life experience that way. But I was also curious to know, like how is it to present work that sort of maybe is more anchored in, I don't know, Mississippi experiences or sort of the southern United States experiences, bringing that and sort of sharing it within the context of the UK or in Tokyo, and just wondering how you see people engaging with it there. There's a difference to how they engage with it than you've seen sort of maybe with a US audience. I'm just curious to think about that sort of that broad-based sort of
Yeah.
engagement people could have with it.
Well, it's not necessarily about Mississippi experience per se. It's
Yeah.
more about connecting through, like the emotions. We all share the same range of emotions that is triggered by different things. And so it's like connecting from that, connecting from a feeling
Mm.
and understanding how a broad, spectrum of that it is. So instead of saying that it is that, but it's more about, I mean, of course, there's like visual cues and uh audible cues of what that would possibly sound like. But I think because, like loving music as much as I do, uh kind of pushed me to be more of a universal
Mhm.
communicator.
Yeah.
So even though these characters are and people, not even characters, but like people are from a different, from a specific demographic, it is a story of a human being, and that is what it all boils down to. So I don't really focus on how they would be perceived, because I understand how they will be experienced.
Mhm.
Let's put a lot of thought into it because of the music.
Well, that actually, thank you for expanding on those ideas, because I do think one of the things that I do find really interesting about the pieces is that they are so sort of anchored in something very personal for you, but they do, like you said, they connect with emotions, or they have the ability to sort of pull out experiences from sort of anybody, and that sort of connection across human experience as well. So I do like that. And, part of what, of course, makes for good art, is the ability to do that. But we have been touching again and again on the role of music for your career. And so I thought this is an image from it was your first solo exhibition in New York City, or in the US, and it was in New York. And with this kind of as our backdrop, I wondered if we could talk a little bit more specifically and sort of at length about the role that music really does play, specifically jazz music. I know you've talked about in your practice. And, I was thinking we have a number of artists in the collection, for instance, who will talk about the influence of music on their art generally, or talk about listening to certain kinds of music while they're creating. But having heard you talk about and and converse about your own experience, it's clear for me, it's not just about it being sort of a straightforward inspiration. It sounds like music for you is almost more of a collaborator, just like your materials are. There's a much deeper kind of connection that I am perceiving in the way you relate to music. And so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that aspect of your work.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is from, I mean, of course, from growing up, but like in my ceramics practice, in a lot of studios, we typically have music playing.
Mhm.
And one of the things that I noticed about myself is the rhythm of the music changes it really controls the pace of how I make, how fast I make, how slow I make. So, you know, I switched from making things more, you know, getting it like machine made and make it look very pristine to um, very much so pay attention and listen to what the clay is doing, which is very natural because it has its own memory.
Mm.
And so, which I learned from a Japanese potter, and it was a little challenging, a little bit, to unlearn the things that I learned, to be more, willing to listen to what the clay wants to do instead of forcing it. And it's kind of like the same way with me reacting to music. And so like everything that the music is doing, I am responding to that. I'm listening to what it's telling me to do.
Mhm.
I do have, symbolisms and things like that that I get from listening to the music. So it's a lot like how the dancers are with the instruments and the music itself. So it's quite similar to that. And so ceramics, historically, especially in Greek theater, you think about the Greek pottery. On the surface is recordings of a lot of it is recordings of performances, live performances, and so that's kind of what the vessels itself represents. It represents the dancers, so what is left behind. So it's kind of like a bit of a tableau, if you will. Not so much, but kind of. So yeah, music choreographs my ceramics a lot. So it's a deep understanding of the
Right.
music. Mhm.
Yeah, I love this sort of visual and sort of thinking about this idea that, I don't know, you're sort of responding to the music and to the clay, which is responding to you, and this sort of inner relationship between the material and the music as a sort of, audible material, and then your body. And it all sort of is leaving a trace of that kind of performance in this tangible object. I love that idea of taking those things into consideration of how these objects come into being. And of course, we haven't yet touched on your own performance pieces, but naturally, given this almost, symbiotic relationship you have with music, it is clearly a key component of your performances. And so I want to share another clip with people This from a performance called Blackbird in Mississippi, which was a commissioned piece that you performed at the Serpentine Pavilion as part of the Serpentine Gallery Park Nights in London a few years back in 2019. So let's try the clip. And I know it will start, just so everybody knows, it starts silently at first, and then there is sound after the first few seconds. So let's take a look and then we'll come talk about it.
Summertime and the living is easy. Your daddy's rich and your mama's good looking. A long way from home.
To hear. I was so thrilled you were able to share that clip with me, just to sort of, I think it so fully captures that sort of interaction of the music and different kinds of music, and different voices of instruments and otherwise, as well as your performance. And can you tell us a little bit more about like how you developed the piece, kind of what story you're telling, and all those collaborators that you worked with?
Yeah, so the architect of the pavilion, he referenced like a blackbird, and so immediately I think of Paul McCartney's Blackbird. Love that song. And and what it originally stands for, symbolizes of like the civil rights. So it's like a Black woman in the South. And so I thought about bringing that place, the feeling of that place to the pavilion. And it's again, it's a mixture of jazz, but also Negro spiritual.
Mhm.
And the purpose of that was to, really talk about, the different times, but also what is going on now, what I'm feeling. I wanted to connect with the people, but just to bring a little bit, I don't know, it's a different connection. So the choreographer, my brother, Albert, he and I, we worked on a piece before, and I was telling him, this is what I'm thinking of doing, and which the choreography was a huge reference to the predominantly Black churches. They have a dance group. It's more like a ministry. So it's called Mime Ministry, which historically that's where like ballet came from, mime dance. So that's kind of what I wanted to do. And, being a part of a church at the time, I've always wanted to do like the mime ministry, but I was too scared to do it. But, wanted to make that reference, and to bring that there. And the choir was great.
Yeah, I know, it sounds amazing.
They were great, top notch, kudos to the director of that. He arranged the vocals, and with the viola player, what's her name? Oh gosh. She was Andrea, great. She had definitely arranged her parts along with the director of the vocals. And I picked the songs. And so it's a John Coltrane references, Nina Simone references. I had her tune her viola to match the tonality of Nina Simone's voice. So it was a very special moment that I wanted to create. I wanted to connect with everyone, which is why it's not like a traditional stage of separation, which is another reference to Greek theater, one of the formats. And so what I wanted to do was like to, connect with people. And it's all about that. It's all about connection. It's not, even though it has, heavy, references to the music, but it's also like, kind of what do you believe in? How do you connect with one another? And, and those performances that I typically do is for people of color, of course, to connect with everyone emotionally, but it's from those references though, like something that we all can see, and it's not like, not giving back, humanity to something that's being dehumanized, because I can't give or take away anyone's humanity. So it is just like visually rehumanizing it, making it more acceptable, but just like kind of relatable, so it's a bit of a limbo dance of figuring out of that and connecting with everybody else.
Yeah, it seems like just the little bit I've seen seems like it was a really, just like a really powerful performance. And for some of the, like all the things you were talking about, I love the idea of it being a response specifically to that sort of pavilion architecture. And so very site specific, but then, I really was struck by everybody sort of on the ground, sort of, right there with you as you performed, and that sort of literal sort of changing of perspective, as opposed to sort of being, like you said, kind of seated in chairs and a stage and things like that. So it seems like, I don't know, it just seemed like it was a really interesting way to address, as you said, some of these more difficult ideas, but bring them to a different, I don't know, sort of transcend some of the early associations and make them more relatable, I guess, in a very direct way, both to you and to the ideas. I'm very sorry I couldn't have seen that in person. So, and I wanted to say, you mentioned the mime ministry aspect, and I know you've talked a little bit about that in relationship to those sort of clay on your face, both in that performance that we just saw, but also in some of your photographs. And wanted to share this image as well with people, since we've seen some of these large portraits. I don't know, maybe they're not quite portraits or self-portraits. Would you characterize them as self-portraits?
Yeah, they're self-portraits.
Okay. But I mean, there's sometimes it's like of me, but not about me kind of situation. So I was just curious. I didn't realize I didn't know.
Yeah, I identified them as self-portraits, but you know, it's very much a reference to like silent films because I love silent films.
Mm.
And it's always that moment, that close-up moment. And what the different portraits that I take of myself is, some of them are slightly different. It looks like, typical deadpan, but it's not necessarily about deadpanning. It's about, you know, I think like for Black women, we are the ones that are seem more serious, and I think other women has as well. But what I've heard a lot of like having resting, face,
Yeah. Yeah.
and the idea of the angry Black woman, and being told you need to smile more, and I'm just like no, by someone of the opposite sex, and is what those things possibly look like, and with the clay, it's more of again, it's the my ministry uh reference, but it's the different African tribe, reference, which is, their references as well. And you know, and it's also about the mask, the idea of a mask, how much of yourself you hide, conceal, and how thick it is determines how much is being concealed, how thin it is determines how much is going to be revealed. Sometimes there are emotions, sometimes there isn't. And it's all depends. It all depends also on the location. Because every location has a different look,
Mhm.
you know, and it's some faces are more, I would say, determined, more angry, you know, some with more emotion, some it's just nothing behind the eyes. So it's just all depends on the space and the location and how it connect with those different spaces as well. And the people.
Yeah.
People in the process are a part of it. They don't know about it. They do now. Um, they, they become part of it because I can't, as much as I try to separate it to give like it just kind of bleeds on into it. So every location and people really influence on how these things come out at the end.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Thank you thank you. I think these are really, I love these images as well. They're really powerful. And like you said, it's like, as I've discovered from our conversation today, certainly, and this, the sort of complexities of references and ways of reading and the kind of layering of meaning that it goes into so much of what you do and how you do it. It's really, I think, a really powerful element to your art. And we're really close to time, but I did want to ask, I've got final image here of what I guess this exhibition literally just closed like 2 days ago, a group exhibition you were in, but I'm wondering, what's coming up next for you? So if people want to see your work, where can they do that? Or what are you working on now? I'm just curious to leave people with some ideas about that.
Right now, I don't have a specific show coming up, but I am working on ceramics, a series called the Hate Blue Period,
Right.
which is a new body of ceramics that is coming up, that's going on right now. And I'm just having fun with that right now. So yeah.
That's it. Yes. Yeah, we have the image on the screen shows a couple of pieces from that series as well. So, it's good to know you're still having fun, and that's always a good sign in everyone's life, and certainly in the creative process, and to keep you moving forward. I will say, I understand from my colleague, we didn't have any questions come up yet from the audience, and we are at time. So I just want to go ahead and say, Thank you so much for joining me today, Shawanda. And I know we all wish you the best in your upcoming endeavors. I look forward to seeing more of the Hate Blue period in particular. And I do want to share with our audience that another way they can engage with you and with the museum coming up is, and this is hot off the press, people, I heard that in late May, you'll be participating in our award-winning social media initiative, #5WomenArtists. And that, of course, challenges participants to discover the work of women artists, and that you'll be a part of that sort of later this spring. So I wanted to encourage people to keep an eye out. You can follow you can follow the hashtag itself, or at Women in the Arts, and you can keep an eye out for Shawanda's post coming up. And so thanks again to Shawanda Corbett very much, and also to our cart captioner, Joy Horton, and my colleague, Addie Gayoso, and to all of you for tuning in. It was a pleasure to have you join us today. And if you wish to revisit any part of this presentation or share it with someone else, it will be available on the museum's YouTube channel in the next couple of weeks. And we hope also, of course, as always, to see you at future events. Thank you so much for joining us today.